Welcome to our online service this morning. So glad to have you with us. I hope that you'll be encouraged this morning. This morning, Reverend Dr. Andrew Sloan will be speaking from Psalm 46 for us, so look forward to that. If you'd like to continue to financially support the work of Orange Baptist Church, the best way to do that is on an online format, and the details will come down below here. Also want to remind you that this Thursday night is a second of our nights of worship. We need you to book in for that, obviously to meet our COVID restrictions. So if you'd like to go back into your weekly update, the link will be there, and we'd love for you to join with us for our night of worship. We also want to remind you that there are a team of elders ready to be praying for you this morning. So if you need prayer or you'd like prayer at any point, particularly after Psalm 46 is unpacked for us by Andrew, then send us an email at prayer@orangebaptistchurch.org.au, and that goes directly to the team of elders, and we want to be spending some time in prayer for you this morning. Hope you'll be encouraged as we worship together in this season. Blessings.
Deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretched treasure. How great the pain of searing love. The Father turns His face away. The souls which Mother chosen bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon the cross, my sin upon His shoulder. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice called out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held Him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me back. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything. No gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection. Why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom. But this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom. I hear the Savior say, thy strength indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. Find in me thine holy love. 'Cause Jesus paid it all to Him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, He washed it white as snow. Lord, now indeed I die, Thy power and Thine alone can raise the leper's spots and melt the heart of stone. Jesus paid it all to Him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, He washed it white as snow. Oh, praise the one who made my dead and raised this life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised this life up from the dead. Jesus. And when before the throne I stand in Him complete, Jesus died my soul to save. My lips shall still repeat that Jesus paid it all to Him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, He washed it white as snow. 'Cause sin had left a crimson stain, He washed it white as snow.
Hi, my name is Ollie and I'll be doing the Bible reading today. I am reading Psalm 46. For the director of music of the sons of Korah, according to the Alamoth, a song. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way, and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains quake with their surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see what the Lord has done, the desolations he has brought on earth. He makes the wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. He says, "Be still, and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The God Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress."
Well, this morning we are really blessed, and I'm certainly very grateful to have the Reverend Dr. Andrew Sloan speak to us this morning from Psalm 46. Andrew is an incredible man of faith who has journeyed through real hardships on multiple levels throughout his life, and yet clings to the promises that we have in Jesus. Andrew was a very influential man for me while I was going through college, and helped me a tremendous amount to understand more of who I am and who God is. Andrew is a lecturer in Old Testament, and really his subject on the Psalter, on the Psalms, was very, very powerful, very shaping for me. So I hope you'll be encouraged as you hear from Andrew this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me with you, even if virtually. In times like this, in the face particularly of COVID-19, it feels like the world is falling apart. We now live in a world of self-isolation and panic buying. It feels as if the world has exploded. What can we do? You know, there are so many ways for the world to fall apart, aren't there? Sometimes it's dramatic, like what we now face, like 9/11. It's like planes flying into buildings, like the recent fires across Australia, and then floods, and then, for us, COVID-19. And sometimes it's like that, not just on the big scale, but on the smaller scale as well. Death of someone we love, or disease, I guess, particularly a concern now. Financial disaster, again, something that some of you may be facing right now. It feels like the world is falling apart. For me, perhaps one of the hardest experiences of that was about 20 years ago. My family and I were over in the US. I was there doing some further study. And just after we'd arrived, just after we'd set up, we were there with our young children, ages 5, 7 and 9. We're just getting them settled, and I got news that my father had had a devastating stroke. My mother called, deeply distressed. She wasn't sure whether my father would see out the next 24 hours. Hard. We had a hard decision to make. I decided in the end to leave my wife and children back in the States, because I hoped I'd be able to go back and go and see my father. This is a day in the days before I at least had a mobile phone, before easy communications, and I had about 30 hours transit time from New Haven on the east coast of the United States all the way back to Sydney, not knowing whether my father would still be alive when I got back home. Times like that, it feels like the world has exploded and now the debris is raining down on us. Sometimes when the world falls apart, it feels like it explodes, and other times it feels like it's just crumbling around us. It's slow, relentless, like a sand castle crumbling slowly before the advancing tide. The disaster just seems to sneak up on us. Little things pile up, perhaps insignificant in themselves, but gradually you feel like a sandcastle nervously facing the oncoming tide. A bad day at work, a difficult boss, a series of small disappointments, a sick husband, a late paycheck, a bad essay, trouble at school, whatever it happens to be. It all mounts up, and I guess that's the way it is for many of us at the moment. It's all mounting up, piece by piece by piece by piece. Anxiety builds, and the world seems an uncertain, dangerous place. That is the world that this psalm addresses. That's the kind of experience to which it speaks. Now, the Psalms are wonderful. They help us to navigate a complex and often difficult world, and they give us lots of strategies. Sometimes to lament, to cry out to God in our pain, sometimes to praise God even in the face of it. But here, the Psalms call us to confident trust. What this psalm does is flash before us snapshots of chaos, images of the world exploding or slowly falling apart. But it does so against the backdrop of confident faith in God's presence. Whether the world has exploded or whether it's crumbling down around us, this psalm says, God is with us. Now, the psalm opens with an extraordinary, confident cry of trust. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. Now notice, it opens, God is our refuge and strength. But notice that this confidence, far from ignoring trouble, is founded on God's action and presence precisely in times of disaster. God is always found a help in trouble. We can trust God now and in the future when things go wrong. That's what this psalm is telling us. Here we're invited to share in the awareness of God's faithfulness in the past, which provides the ground for our trust now and in any imaginable future. It is, if you like, a light which backlights all our experience, changing the way we see it, transforming how it affects us. And so, having established this certainty of faith, that God is with us, the psalm turns to the first snapshot of chaos. And it's of a world-shaking natural disaster, but backlights that by the knowledge of God's faithful presence. That's what we find in verses 2 and 3. We will not fear, though the earth give way. The picture here is of a huge earthquake. An earthquake so great that the mountains, the very pillars of the earth, as the ancient world saw it, seem about to slide into the sea. The world itself shudders and seems about to collapse into the chaos from which it came. I've never experienced an earthquake like that. Some people have. The Boxing Day quake in 2004 around the Pacific Rim. But I have friends who lived through the Newcastle earthquake of 1989, going back quite a while now. Or spoken to people who endured the Christchurch earthquake in 2011. They tell me an earthquake like that is the most frightening experience they've ever had. The ground itself, the very image of stability, rock solid, except it's not. The earth itself seems to give way. The world turned against them. That's sometimes what life feels like, isn't it? That the very certainties on which we establish our life crumble and give way beneath us. That's what it felt like for me when I heard the news of my father's stroke. That may be what it is that you're experiencing now as you face isolation or the loss of your job or the uncertainties of what's happening with your education, not being able to visit vulnerable people that you love. The thing is, it's in circumstances like that, it is at just such a time that the psalmist says, we will not fear. The community of faith can have confidence even then, for God is our refuge. Now, this is no empty, pious statement. This was written by someone who lived in Palestine, in ancient Israel. They knew about earthquakes. They knew about the uncertainties and instabilities of their life and even of the physical universe around them. But it is in times like that, even then, the psalmist says we can trust God. Our trust doesn't need to wait until the quaking stops. Nor does God's help mean that the earth grows still. It is in the quaking that we can trust. For it is in the quaking that God is found a ready help. It is even in the midst of the profound changes we're experiencing now in the face of this pandemic that we can know that God is found a ready help in just such times of trouble. But that's not the only thing that this psalm addresses. You see, ancient Israel, Palestine, is a place not just of frequent natural disasters, of earthquakes and the like, but it's a place of seemingly never-ending violence, as even its recent history attests. About every 30 years, some empire or another went through that territory. Every 30 to 40 years. Over the last 3,000 years. The sense that history itself was falling apart was something that Old Testament believers were quite familiar with. And here they're called to remember it in this next section of Psalm 46. But again, to do so in light of confident trust in God and God's care for God's people and God's care for God's city. But let me hold on for a moment before we get to the chaos of history. Let's think about the backlight that illuminates it. That's what we find in the next section of the psalm. It opens, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Now, verse 4, there is a river, uses what is for us a strange image to ground this trusting certainty. There is a river. Now, the thing is, there is no river in Jerusalem. The best it has is the Gihon Spring. It's a little trickle. You can literally wade through it, and the water never goes above my thighs. This isn't speaking of a physical phenomenon in the physical city. This is an image, a metaphor, a way of picturing God's presence and the blessing and security it brings. For water, particularly in a city, is essential for life. Water during a siege is what gives some certainty and stability to those who have to live within this city's walls. It's interesting here. In the previous section, water, you may remember, raged and roared. Now water gently trickles and provides the ground for confidence and trust, because now it represents not violent rebellion, but God's gracious presence. And so, the psalmist says, Jerusalem will never fall apart. It will never stagger, unlike the waters before, unlike the nations in this section. In the midst of the chaos of history, Zion stands secure. Why? Why that sense of security? Because God is there. And God will come to Zion's aid. Sometimes people think of texts like this as reflecting a kind of arrogant nationalism. We're Israel, hey, all's cool. No. Sometimes people think that a psalm like this reflects a naive belief that nothing can go wrong, that God is in God's heaven or in God's city, all is right with our world. No. Here's the thing. Psalm 46, probably written during the period of the monarchy in Israel, is in the book of Psalms, a book which finds its final shape after Israel's exile, after they were taken out of their land, after the city was destroyed and they were brought back. And it's a song that was still sung by people in exile and people after the exile ended. This isn't naive belief that nothing can go wrong. Rather, this is a backlit vision. It's a confidence that despite the chaos of history, chaos that the city itself endured, God is present with God's people and so they are secure. And that's where this section starts. And then it unfolds for us this picture of chaos, the violent raging of the nations. The nations stagger and roar, even as the mountains and the waters did in the first section of the psalm. And this chaos, unlike the chaos of the first section, which is nature falling apart, this chaos is an image of rebellion against Yahweh, against the Lord. It's a revolt, of course, it's futile. For God speaks and the nations fall. Now, for me again, an experience of that kind of world-encompassing violence is unimaginable. I've not lived through that. Many of our people in our world have. For some, it's all too real. In a church I pastored years ago, I spoke with a young woman who was a social worker and psychologist, and she worked with children after the Rwanda genocide back in 1994-95. She knew what that kind of violence, that kind of chaos looks like. Maybe some of you do as well. There are lots of people in our world who've fled violence and persecution in North Africa, the Middle East, Asia. Perhaps that's been your experience. Here's the thing. This psalm tells us the Lord is with us. In such circumstances, even then, this psalm says, we can have confidence because of God's presence. Again, it doesn't have to wait until the roaring stops. Nor does it mean that God's help means the nations grow still. It is in the roaring that we can trust. For it is in the roaring, in the chaos, that God is already present. Now, for Israel, that presence was particularly connected with Zion and the temple. But again, remember that for most of the users of this psalm through most of its history, Zion had fallen, the temple had been destroyed. And of course for us as Christians, we recognise this side of the death and resurrection of Jesus, that God's presence is not localised in a particular place and is certainly not limited to it. Surely for us, in light of Christ, the one in whom God dwells bodily, the one who calls us to come and drink from waters that will never be exhausted, the one from whose love nothing can separate us. This sense of God's presence, which grounds certainty in the midst of chaos, is all the more powerful. The psalm moves on and comes to a head, really. Comes to a head in verses 8 through 11, where the psalm turns from looking at the world backlit by the light of faith to looking directly at the light of faith itself. In these verses, the picture of God's sovereign rule reaches a climax. The climax is the cessation of all conflict, all chaos, in Yahweh's victory over all foes. And so in verse 8, we hear the worshipping community called to come and see the works of Yahweh. The light that has been used to illuminate their experience of chaos is itself examined. They turn from the snapshots of chaos to the bright picture of God's ultimate peace. And so come and see what the Lord has done, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. He says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. The picture that emerges in these verses is an interesting one. It's a picture of what you could call the war to end all wars. It is, if you like, one image of life lined up against God and God's purposes, and of God's victory over all that stands against that God and those purposes. For verse 9 pictures for us a battlefield after a devastating victory by Yahweh over every enemy. It's a picture where we see broken bows and shattered spears, burning carts, I think, rather than shields, the provision wagons which allow an army to march and survive and to do its conquering. All of that is destroyed. This is an aftermath of devastating defeat. It's like pictures of modern battlefields, the scattered weapons burning tanks and trucks after the US retreat from Saigon in the Vietnam War, or perhaps a scene from one of the Iraq conflicts. It's in that context. It's in this picture of a devastating military defeat that we hear this cry in verse 10. And it's actually a climactic cry. We often see this as a gentle, quiet text. That's how it's often portrayed on posters and teacups and stuff like that. It's often used in Christian spirituality as a call to quiet contemplation. That's not quite right. This is not a "be still and know that I am God." No. This is a call to stop raging, to stop conflict, to end resistance, to truly recognize that God is God. Not "be still and know that I am God," but stop it. Put it down. Drop it. It's a call for us to turn our back on all that dishonours God and twists human community and damages God's good earth. It's a call to recognise the truly awesome majesty of God, the one who establishes God's rule over God's enemies. Not a call to quiet contemplation, but to surrender. The recognition that God is exalted amongst the nations, exalted over the earth, needs to be seen in that light. For the nations, remember, are those who stood against God. The earth is the sphere of God's victorious rule in creation and history. And that's the context of the call to acknowledge God. The call to be still, the demand that we stop, is the demand that we recognise God's absolute sovereign power and submit to God. And it's then that we can know that the Lord is with us. It is then and only then that we can experience God's rule as that which blesses and gives us peace, whatever our circumstances. And some peace it is. For this God is with us. The God of power and might is the one who is with us. And God is with us as our helper, our strong place. Is it any wonder that the psalm rings with such clear confidence and trust? For in the light of the knowledge that this God is with us, even chaos, the chaos of nature, the chaos of history, becomes the sphere of trust. God is with us. But what about when our world falls apart? It's all very well to talk about earthquakes and violence. That, for us, at least for most of us, is safely distant. It's so far from our experience that we can say, sure, we can trust God when creation and history are falling apart. But what about those times when it feels like our world is falling apart? When our world feels like a dangerous, uncertain, unstable place? When perhaps a virus interrupts our life and our economy? It is then, it is now, that this psalm invites us to say God is our refuge and our strength. It doesn't do so in a vacuum. For it calls us to remember God's great saving acts in the past, God's work in creation, in nature, in history, in saving God's people Israel, and so demonstrating that God alone is sovereign Lord. And as we remember on this side of the death and resurrection of Jesus, we call to mind that greatest act of God's, an act in which God demonstrated God's own sovereign rule precisely in the chaos of suffering and seeming defeat. But we also turn, as does the book of Revelation, to see God's future action, in which that sovereign glory will be shown in God's triumph over every foe. God is our refuge and strength. That God is our refuge and strength. And so in times of chaos, when everything seems to fall apart around us, we remember. And those images of God's sovereign power backlight our experiences. And that enables us to say, even when the world explodes or crumbles around us, God is our refuge and our strength. Something I, for me, uncharacteristically found on that long flight home back in 1999. A long flight in which I still didn't know whether my father was alive or dead, when I was cut off from all news after his devastating stroke, not knowing what I would find when I finally got home. On that flight, something very strange happened. It's not my normal experience. Normally when things go wrong, I find it's the lament psalms to which I turn, but not on this occasion. It was almost as if God was sitting in a seat beside me, whispering the words of Psalm 46 in my ear, giving me the confidence that I needed to trust, even when it felt like my world was crumbling around me. That's the invitation we have in this psalm. When our world seems to be falling apart, God is sitting next to us, whispering in our ears the words of this psalm, giving us the confidence that we need to face this or any other day. Amen.
I'll raise a hallelujah in the presence of my enemies. I'll raise a hallelujah louder than the unbelief. I'll raise the hallelujah weapon is a melody. Raise a hallelujah. Oh, heaven comes to fight for me. 'Cause I'm gonna sing in the middle of a storm. Louder and louder, gonna hear my praises roll up from the ashes. Hope will arise. Death is defeated, the King is alive. Raise a hallelujah with everything inside of me. I'll raise a hallelujah. I will watch the darkness flee. I'll raise a hallelujah in the middle of the mystery. I'll raise a hallelujah. Oh, fear you lost your hold on me. I'm gonna sing in the middle of a storm. Louder and louder, gonna hear my praises roll up from the ashes. Hope will arise. Death is defeated, the King is alive. I'm gonna sing in the middle of a storm. Oh, louder and louder, gonna hear my praises roll up from the ashes. Hope will arise. Death is defeated, the King is alive. Sing louder. Oh, sing louder. Oh, sing a little louder. Oh, sing a little louder. Oh, sing a little louder. In the presence of my enemies. Sing a little louder. Oh, louder than the unbelief. Sing a little louder. My weapon is a melody. Oh, sing a little louder. Heaven comes to fight for me. I'm gonna sing in the middle of a storm. Louder and louder, gonna hear my praises roll up from the ashes. Hope will arise. Death is defeated, the King is alive. I'm gonna sing in the middle of a storm. Louder and louder, gonna hear my praises roll up from the ashes. Hope will arise. Death is defeated, the King is alive. Raise a hallelujah in the presence of my enemies. I'll raise a hallelujah louder than the unbelief. I'll raise a hallelujah. My weapon is a melody. I'll raise a hallelujah. Oh, heaven comes to fight for me.